any athlete coming out of the Commonwealth Games feeling low, feeling lost, feeling life isn't worth living, feeling abandoned, those feelings are normal. They're part of the human response to high level experience that you've put everything into. It is normal and it will pass.
Hi, Karen. It's my pleasure to have you on the Evidence Strong show. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, Alex and anyone listening. My name is Dr. Karen Howells. I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I'm also an applied practitioner and been practicing as a sports psychologist for well over a decade. I have a number of research areas that I'm interested in, primarily two. One is about adversity and positives we take from that adversity. So something called adversarial growth, and also the post-Olympic blues. So the post-Olympic blues, really, as it says on the box, is about the blues, the negative experiences that Olympians experience when they've come home. So those are my two main research areas that I'm currently interested in.
Perfect. So as we are recording this conversation, Olympic weightlifters and powerlifters arrived at Commonwealth Games as many other athletes, and they will be battling for the next 2 weeks on possibly the highest stage of their career. It's close to, it's not Olympics, but it is close to. So I think your studies and your expertise are very relevant and may be helpful in very soon. So I'm excited to have you. We'll be talking post-Olympic blues. You mentioned a little bit, but maybe you want to extend. What is the definition? What post-Olympic blues is?
Okay, so I suppose in the context of your audience at the moment, and obviously the Commonwealth Games is really at the foreground now. The post-Olympic blues is a expression that's been used in the media and by Olympians to describe their negative experiences after the Games. Specifically, we're looking at a sense of loss, a loss of purpose, no goals, feelings that are akin to depression. So we're not saying it is depression, but a sense of loss of motivation, not wanting to do anything, sad, emotional. Some athletes report far greater, far more intense symptoms. Some have talked about suicidal thoughts and so on.
Wow.
So those were the narratives, the accounts that athletes were talking about in their blogs, tweets, on social media. And it's really only recently, I suppose, in the last, and in research terms, this is relatively recent, in the last 8 to 10 years, that researchers have started to look at this and started to conceptualize what the post-Olympic blues means. And it is not straightforward. We don't fully have a coherent understanding of what it is. Some researchers are really looking at it at face value, the blues. I'm feeling a little low. I'm feeling just a bit down. Others have medicalized it and looking at it in terms of post-Olympic depression. Others have taken a broader conceptualization of it, that actually it's post-Olympic experience that actually has negatives and positives, that in general psychology, we are sometimes inclined to really look at just the negatives. So if we look at sport injury, for example, for many, many years, we just looked at the negatives without recognizing, actually, there might be some positives that come out of this. So in terms of the post-Olympic blues, it's difficult for me to say this is exactly what it is, because the different researchers are looking at it in different ways. But that actually doesn't stop us from talking about how the experience impacts on individuals competing at the highest level. And I think that's maybe in the context of the Commonwealth Games. The research so far really has been constrained to the Olympic Games and the Paralympics. So there's research in both in the Summer Olympics and Paralympics and the Winter Olympics and Paralympics. We haven't yet started to explore other international events like the Commonwealth Games or the FIFA World Cup or the Tour de France, anything like that. We have at the moment just looked at this one big event. That's not to say that we can't take things from our understanding of that and apply them to, in this case, the Commonwealth Games. So I would say anything that I'm talking about from the research that refers to either the Olympic Games or the Paralympic Games can still be applied to the Commonwealth Games. Although I do that with the caveat that we haven't actually researched that yet. It's understandable that when the Games are over, the coach disappears off on holiday. The psychologist disappears on holiday. The S&C coach goes, they take a break. And that's absolutely right for their mental health and well-being, because we've got to look after them as well. But just at the point that the athletes really need support, the support structure that has absolutely enveloped them for at least 6 months previously, potentially 4 years, they're suddenly gone. The coach may be on holiday, may have lost his or her job, the sports psychologist is taking a break, and the athlete's got nowhere to turn other than their own social networks, so their family. So I suppose that's a very long way of saying, I think this is why we're not very good at, and B, it hasn't been looked at, because the focus really has been on performance and supporting the athletes support to get to that point over a number of studies, some which I've been involved in, and some which some other researchers across Europe have been involved in. Athletes tend to be aware that there is this thing called the post-Olympic blues. It's on the periphery. It's not at the forefront of their mind, but they're aware that they may feel a bit low after the games. But many first-timers, and the first-timers are those, who it takes by surprise, they go, but I will be fine. It won't happen to me. And although we don't talk about it, certainly in any of the academic papers, but there's this idea of something called arrival fallacy, which is the belief that once we have achieved our goal, once we got there, we have arrived, we have achieved. And in my research, I talk a lot about the Olympic dream. Now, that the dream may have been held for many, many years. Even prior to being an elite athlete, it could have been a dream from childhood. And once I get it, my life, I will have arrived, I will have achieved that. That's it. My life is fulfilled. And even when they're told, afterwards, you may feel feelings of loss, loss of purpose. They kind of, I've heard of this, but it's not going to happen to me because once I've achieved this. And actually what they find afterwards is actually life hasn't changed. So in my original study that I did, carried out after the Rio Olympic Games with Dr. Matthias Lucassen, we talked to a number of female athletes. Because at the time there was probably I'm not going to say there's a huge amount of evidence, but female athletes potentially experience it more than male athletes. But I'm saying that very cautiously because we don't have a huge amount of evidence to suggest that. But we looked at female athletes, and one of them likened it to getting married and the kind of wedding blues. And she said, so she was married. She said, build up to this day, and it's a fairy tale wedding you've always dreamed of, and the day is just perfect. The dress is perfect, you look amazing, you're the center of attention, and you wake up the next morning and you're in bed with the same man and there's still hairs in the sink. So there was this kind of light humor that she likened it to, that actually it doesn't matter what the big experience is, but when you've really built up to it, actually it doesn't matter how wonderful it is, nothing changes. And that nothing change was also likened to, we talked about the mundane in our first study, where certainly in the build up to the big games. So as we are speaking now and recording this, many athletes are out on their camps, wherever that is. So I'm in Wales at the moment, and Welsh Athletics have just flown out to Portugal. So they've got their camp in Portugal before flying back to Glasgow for the Commonwealth Games. They from the moment they arrive in Portugal will be looked after. They will be fed. They will be given their accommodation. They will be driven places. They will have a program to stick to. They then turn up your athletes will turn up in Glasgow, and they'll be either in a village or they will be in a dedicated hotel, but they will be in a dedicated space where actually everything is provided for them. Athletes I've spoken to who've talked about the Olympic village, have said, it's almost like being a child in a sweetie shop. Whatever you want is there 24 hours a day, and it's just wow, amazing. So everything is provided for them. And then they get home and they've got this period away from training. One of my participants said, and I had to go grocery shopping. I had to go to Tesco, I just had to go back to doing all these mundane things. And actually, I didn't like it. I don't want to do these things. I've been held up, and we talked about celebrity. They're celebrity for a period of time, and then they're not. It's all gone. So in terms of the athlete expectations, first of all, they don't think it's going to happen to them, and the surprise that nothing has changed is I don't think any of them have ever used the word shock, but I suppose that's my interpretation. The shock that even if they've won a gold medal, and across the studies, we've looked at those who achieved their goals, who didn't achieve their goals, who won medals, who didn't win medals. And although the experiences are slightly different and the intensity is different, even the gold medalists, but I thought my life was going to be different. I thought it was all going to change. And actually it hasn't. I think as sports fans, putting perhaps a different hat on, we're very fickle. We absolutely buy into the sporting event that's going on. So depending on your interests, you may have absolutely bought into Wimbledon or Tour de France or the World Cup. And it is everything. We in the UK, we were even talking, it didn't happen, but about maybe children being allowed the day off school because England were playing at 1 o'clock UK time, 1 o'clock in the morning UK time. Children should be allowed to watch this, and absolutely buying into it. But very quickly when it's over, we switch our focus to something else. And whilst we may remember what has just happened, it's gone. Right now, let's the next one. And I'm guilty of this. I was watching Wimbledon, a little bit of the World Cup, and now Tour de France, and Wimbledon's gone. As a fan, I'm not interested in what they're doing now. I'm now focused on something else. So we're very fickle. But the athletes I was center of attention. I was celebrity. I'm television, media, and I can talk a little bit in a minute about the flight home. But all of a sudden, almost nobody, and that is very, very difficult to process and really to make sense of. So the first study, your listeners and viewers would probably think of small scale. So all of my research is qualitative. So it's about the lived experience. So both studies are qualitative, which is really about talking to people. So I don't do questionnaires and psychometric tests and so on. So my first study only involved 4 female athletes, 4 female Olympians, who I interviewed 6 weeks after the Rio Olympic Games and then 6 months later. And in those interviews, really trying to get an in-depth, and that's what qualitative does. It looks at depth rather than breadth, really in-depth understanding of the journey. So becoming an Olympian, the Olympic experience and the post-Olympic experience. In research, we have a ethical responsibility not to disclose who our participants are. So we have to anonymize them. However, I'm going to disclose who one of my participants was for a very good reason. So in my first study, I interviewed the pole vaulter, Holly Bradshaw. So Holly Bradshaw, at the point that I interviewed her, had competed 3 Olympic Games. After we'd completed that study, she contacted me and we developed a friendship and then a working relationship. And she decided she wanted to do research into the post-Olympic blues with me and Matthias Lucassen. And so the 3 of us, so she joined our research team and she was then part of our second study. She accessed the participants as an Olympian herself, and she was our focus group facilitator. So just going on to the second study, our second study, the intention was that we would find out from athletes in focus groups, so focus groups of 4 to 8 athletes, where Holly Bradshaw was the facilitator. So she was talking to them about their experiences, but she was also researcher as participant because she was also an Olympian. We ultimately used her comments as well as data. But the intention was that in these focus groups, we would have sufficient content to start to develop an intervention. We were getting the voices. That didn't happen because of what came out of the focus groups, because of what the athletes talked about. It made us realize that actually we needed to take a step back and get a better understanding of what the post-Olympic blues is really about. I don't like to use the word causes, but the kind of antecedents, the mechanisms that lead to it. The 2 studies together, the first really identifies what we think the post-Olympic blues is, how it is experienced by the participants, and the second study builds on that, but also starts to talk about what the athletes want. And I think that's really important in that second study. That was the study you asked me to talk about initially, because it really, the athletes were brutal about their interpretations of what they went through, but also what they think they need. Now, I'm not going to say just because they think they need A means it's the right thing, but we have to listen to the athletes. And what came out of that study was, I'm going to say, for me as a sports psychologist, both shocking and humbling, and yeah, very interesting. In the first study, there was a thread that went through everything that the athletes talked about, and this was really reinforced by the second study. So the first study, 4 participants, and second study, 14 participants. And those 14 participants really reiterated what the 4 participants in that first study said. This is related really to celebrity identity. So from, I suppose, leaving aside the athlete journey, maybe from the age of 10, 12, working hard to become an elite athlete, at the point that an elite athlete becomes a potential Olympian, Paralympian, an elite athlete who's representing their country at Commonwealth Games, for example, that tends to happen at an event. So a qualifying event, different sports do it in different ways. But at the point that an athlete realizes they are going to the games, their life does change. I've been quite heavily involved in swimming over the years and was at the Commonwealth Trials back in 2014. And when the athletes were selected for the Commonwealth Trials, selected for their country, they went into media training straight away. They were trained in how to speak to the media, because from that point onwards, they were going to be in front of the camera, talking to the Scottish press, the Welsh press, the English press, media training. They then went to a kitting out ceremony. We've seen this with the Commonwealth Games. And it's big on social media. They go to a location and they get given their formal opening ceremony outfit. They get given their competition clothing, and it often it's in a big hall, and there are just piles of clothes that they kind of grab, and again, it's like this kind of sweetie shop. But from that point onwards, everything becomes about this identity, the identity as an Olympian, the identity as a Paralympian, that identity. And we see that with the Commonwealth Games. There was some controversy on social media over the Team Scotland's outfits, but even that controversy just showed that the way that they were dressing the athletes and starting to talk about the athlete as a commodity. The athletes are being dressed in a certain way. They've been given clothing. They've been given media training. They're being molded. And the athletes started to talk about commodified. They were commodification. They were just commodities. And they were being molded in the way that they looked, the way they dressed, the way they behaved to the cameras. But this also had a celebrity element to it, that they're in the spotlight. They're local media interviewing. They're giving autographs to children. Children go to swim camps and athletic camps and get to meet the athletes who are going off to the games. Everything is about building them as celebrities. So all the while they're training, they're preparing for their performance, there is a new level, and this new level is about celebrity, about becoming, and we see this in the Olympic Games, becoming an Olympian. Now, this is something that I think is probably specific to the Paralympic and the Olympic Games, that I'm struggling to find the word for the Commonwealth Games. It is not there's no word that says I am an Olympian or I am a Paralympian for the Commonwealth Games, as far as I'm aware. But certainly with the Paralympics, the Olympics, they become an Olympian, become a Paralympian, and they're allowed to put OLY, PLY after their name. So it's being reinforced here. They then get to the village, and this will be the case at the Commonwealth Games as well. They're celebrities. Everything they want, it's there. They want a massage, it's there. They want food, it's there. Whatever they desire, it's there. And certainly at the Olympic Games, and my participants in the first study talked about this, they're even given little cards that say, once an Olympian, always an Olympian. So everything is reinforcing this identity, and that identity is internalized. And we see this through both of my studies and all the other studies that have been done subsequently. This idea that I am an Olympian, I am a Paralympian. It has become part of my identity. So that is one of the most important elements in terms of the build-up and what makes the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games potentially different, is this sense of identity. But we're going to see it in the Commonwealth Games, with the outfitting and the way they're treated in the village. To a certain extent, I'm going to leave the performance out of it, because we see the performance. We know the athletes have prepared for the performance. They do their best. And I am a a believer, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about an 8-year-old swimmer, doing their first 50 meters butterfly, or we're talking about Michael Phelps at the Olympic Games doing his 200 fly in 2008 and his goggles coming off. But it doesn't matter what level you're at. I believe that the majority of athletes are doing their best. So at the Olympic Games, the Paralympic Games, the athletes are performing to their very best. And they have to reconcile their performances with their expectations. Holly, in both studies, talked about not quite meeting goals or expectations. She came fourth, which any athlete will know is probably the worst position to come, because that goal of podium is just so close, but just out of reach. And they have to reconcile that over time and look at their own performances and work out, could I have done anything differently? Reflect on it. And elite athletes are actually very good at doing that. So in terms of the journey, and I am going to leave the performance element out of it because we know so much about that already. So then we have the coming home. And this is something that if there are any coaches listening, any national governing bodies, this is something that I'm absolutely passionate about and was, I'm going to say, one of the most predominant elements of both studies. And this was the coming home. So we have athletes who have formed, and the buzz of the Olympic Games, I'm going to say the buzz of the Commonwealth Games, it carries on until the athletes come home, particularly if we've had good outcomes. So in both the studies I carried out, participants talked about the 2016 Rio Olympic Games. And they talked about turning up at Rio de Janeiro airport and going in the airport and out onto the pan. And there's a British Airways Boeing jet. That's been painted gold because 2016 Team GB did superbly well. So there's this plane painted gold to celebrate the experiences, to celebrate the achievements. And as a sports fan, I suppose, and as a sports psychologist, I watched them on the television arrive at Heathrow, and here's this gold jet on the pan and the steps. And then the gold medal winners come down, and they're all in their kit. And it's just, wow, this is amazing. And it made for superb television. And then maybe a day or two later, they went off on the open top bus around London and, crowds cheering. And we have this wonderful media spectacle that as viewers, as fans, we're going, wow, this is amazing. Teams look great, superb. So what we found in the studies is when you scratch the surface of that goal, the experience for the athletes was horrific. So when the athletes got on to, and I'm going to say this was talked about a lot in the first study. In the second study, it was the overwhelming conversation in all of the focus groups where individuals had been to Rio. And we know it happened in Tokyo as well, although to a lesser extent because of COVID. And we know that it happened in Paris in 2024, although not with a jet. This was with a train coming back to the UK. When the athletes got onto the flight, they were allocated seats. And they were allocated seats in accordance with their performance. So the gold medal winners went into first class, the silver and bronze went into business, and everybody else was seated in accordance with their performances in economy. And there was free champagne flowing and a great party going on down in first class. And in economy, there were attempts to prevent them from going into first class and celebrating too. They were kept back. They weren't allowed into first class to celebrate. So some of the athletes talked about taking sleeping tablets to just hide from it. Others talked about it was, and I'm not going to use the language they use, but that was not my flight. As in, what we saw on the media, that was not my experience. They were angry. Now, Holly carried out focus groups in 2020 and 2021. So some of it was done kind of around the COVID era, but we're talking 5 or 6 years after that flight. And the anger that the athletes still felt about being put at the back of economy where their friend and teammate was in first class and they weren't allowed to celebrate with them. Anger was as raw as it was on that day. The language they use, the profanity, the real venom, they're so upset and so angry. And it still happens. Now, there will be people listening to this who will say, those who won deserve that accolade. They deserve that attention. And I'm not going to disagree with that statement, but putting somebody on a flight who maybe has met their performance expectations. So 2 of the participants in my first study who didn't medal, they were very low down in terms of the outcome. They had far exceeded their previous performances. They had performed the best experiences, their best performances ever, but they were still put at the back of the flight. They were still not allowed to celebrate. So I get that it's right to celebrate our successes, but the athletes on that flight it was a horrific experience for them.
It almost sounds like the message was, if you medaled, you matter. If you did not medal, we don't care how you feel and what your experience going home is. It's not about you.
And absolutely. And that was also reinforced by the media, both at Heathrow when they arrived home, but also subsequent. The media were, who are you? What did you do? And they didn't want to interview those who hadn't medaled because it is all about the medalists. And that was one of my themes in the first study. And in the first study, I didn't have any medalists. In the second study, I did. But in the first study, there was this perception that actually, if you didn't win a medal, if you were a nothing.
Wow.
And here we are talking about Olympians, athletes who have got to the very highest level in sport that exists. And they were a nothing unless they've medaled. Now, the second study, in some ways, overturned that the medalists' experience was no better, really, because even though they were centre of attention for a few more days and they were getting the media interviews and so on and invited into local schools to show their medal, very quickly they realised their lives hadn't changed either. Actually having a medal, some of them talk about, well, it's in a drawer. It doesn't mean anything. It hasn't changed my life. I still don't have any money. I'm still struggling financially. I was still part of this sausage factory. I was just spat out at the other end when I was no longer needed. But certainly in that first study, the athletes, because they hadn't won medals, perceived it was all about medalists. When we spoke to the medalists, they were going, no, we got to celebrate at the front of that jet, but actually nothing's changed. We have been discarded too. We don't matter. We got the medal. We provided the funding really for the national governing body, and some of them weren't even selected for the next Olympic Games because of their age. So the coming home experience is pretty horrific. So Paris 2024, there was no jet, but there was a train that went from Paris to London, or Eurotunnel. And I spoke to 3 athletes in a different study that's not yet published, who talked about the media were running down the corridor. And here are these 3 athletes sitting there, and the media, who are you? How did you do? And no, okay, we're carrying on, and we're heading to the first class carriage where all the medalists are. And these 3 actually very well-known athletes, sitting there, and because they didn't win medals, the media are just running past them, literally trying to get to the medal winners. So the them and us still exists, and it existed in 2024. Now, interestingly, I'm working at the moment with a researcher in Europe who was talking about the experience of Swiss athletes. And I believe in Switzerland, they have different terms for an Olympian who went to the Olympic Games and medaled, and an Olympian who went to the Olympic Games and didn't medal. So in the UK and in the English-speaking world, we have an Olympian, and that's somebody who's been to the Olympic Games. They have 2 terms, and I don't know what those terms are because I only speak English. But they have 2 different terms, one for those who medaled and for those who didn't. So in other places, the differences between the medalists and the non-medalists is even stark. So we have this coming home, and we have this coming home, I'm going to say, drama around the flight or the train. We then have the issue, I've talked a little bit about the mundane. We have the issue of no support, because the coaches are gone, the sports psychologists are gone, the physios are gone. Everybody has gone, and they've gone either because they've lost their jobs or they're taking a break because of their own risk of burnout. So the athletes then turn to whoever's left, and whoever's left is really their own support networks, their partners, their husbands, their wives, their parents, their sisters, their friends. And actually they find that support lacking too, because the families, and we know this through many, many studies, families make sacrifice for elite athletes. And I've had athletes talk about, my husband took all of his leave to come to the Olympic Games with me. So as soon as we got back, he went back to work. But I needed him at home. But actually, he'd done his supporting role in his mind. We had mothers who had switched their attention from the athlete. They'd gone and watched them. The athlete was centre of the family, who then switched their attention onto the sibling, who's getting married or who's having a baby. And you've had your time. we've supported you at the Olympic Games. Your dream is fulfilled. Now we're focusing on your sister who's having a baby, or we're focusing on your brother who's doing this. So they felt abandoned, and abandoned was a word that came to both studies. They felt abandoned by the national governing bodies. They felt abandoned by their families. They felt abandoned by the public. This just sense of loss of everything that they had suddenly gone. In psychology and sports psychology, we talk about athletic identity, and this applies to anyone who's performing at a high level. And athletic identity becomes everything. I am a swimmer, I'm a footballer, I'm a runner, I'm a weightlifter, and that is all that matters. And to reach the highest level, for many, that is the only route. Now, as a sports psychologist, I would say actually we need to look at developing a multi-dimensional identity. But the reality is, particularly once they've been selected for international competition, really everything else, nothing else matters. Relationships put on hold, families put on hold. But there is an expectation, well, when the games are over, then I can spend more time with my partner. Then I can spend more time with my family. Then I can spend more time with my friends, without perhaps appreciating that those people have been very supportive in the background, potentially. And actually, once the games are over, those individuals are, okay, now we're getting on with our lives. Actually, we have been in the wings supporting you all the way. Now it's my turn. Whereas the athletes are going, but I've made sacrifices. And now I want to spend time with family. Now I want to do this. But the family are, well, no, actually, our focus is elsewhere. And it would be very easy to criticize the athletes for their selfishness, that why should everybody else drop everything even after the games? But because of this idea of celebrity that we came out of that first study, they have been made to feel special. They've been made to feel like they're the most important individuals, and that's been reinforced over and over and over and over. And then they come home and actually they're not only not special anymore, but they're not priority anymore. Other people in their social networks matter just as much, and that's a very difficult step to come down.
I have a tricky question. Is the celebrity status in their mind necessary to be able to make these sacrifices and to achieve the best level they can be? Is this a negative result, or is it a necessary step into greatness?
That's an excellent question, and I can't answer it with the confidence of data to say this is what we found. I can provide my opinion, which is almost certainly yes, that to perform at that level, they have to internalize it. They have to believe, I am the best. I am special. I am invincible. I can overcome any adversity. That is necessary to perform at the highest level. And high level sport is brutal. So I think it is necessary, but the consequence of that is this massive fall afterwards. So actually kind of moving on to what do we do about all this? I'm not suggesting that we get rid of all of that. I don't like the flight and that separation. What has come out of the athletes' voices, particularly in the second study, where the title is Abandoned to Manage the Post-Olympic Blues. They felt abandoned, and it really started on that journey home. I think that journey home has to be changed. I fundamentally disagree with that. But the athletes do need to be built up. They do need to be feel that they are something special, but they need support afterwards. They absolutely fundamentally need the support to actually just come down, take some time off, to reflect, to refresh, rejuvenate, and make decisions. And that is, so there are two areas where we are absolutely lacking, and that is psychoeducation first. So before the Olympic Games, the notion that actually afterwards it is going to be, and to provide some coping strategies, probably run by sports psychologists going into the games, that actually this is how to manage it afterwards. And then after the games, there needs to be a level of support. Now, a lot of national governing bodies, particularly in the UK, go through a decompression. So they'll do a session with a sports psychologist where they decompress. But what came out very clearly out of the focus group study that Holly was facilitating was the desire for peer support, that the Olympians wanted a network of former Olympians who have been through it themselves. And actually just somebody I can talk to, somebody I can say, actually, this is what I'm feeling. And for that person to go, yeah, mate, I've been there before. I've been through it. I know how you feel. And this was the thing that was disappointing and a little bit humbling, was that they didn't want to speak to sports psychologists. They didn't want to talk to the, I'm going to say, experts. They wanted to talk to people who'd been through it. They wanted to be supported by people who really knew what it felt like, because they felt very alone, and that others couldn't empathize. Others couldn't say, yeah, we really know how you feel. And it's all very well a sports psychologist like me saying, I appreciate how you feel, but I've never experienced it. So whilst as a psychologist, I can say, but there are lots of things we can do for these athletes. We can do cognitive behavioral therapy. We can do some mindfulness. We can do some goal reevaluation, take some time off, all these psychological strategies that we can put in place, and there's evidence to say they work. What the athletes want is a support system that is made up of people who have been there. And I have to say, in the United States, they are very good at this. There's an organization, a private organization called Athlete Soul out in the States that do just that. It's made up of ex-Olympians who provide webinars and support and mentoring systems for Olympians. But we should be bringing that into our systems to say, okay, you've come home, your coach is gone, your sports psychologist is gone. Yeah, you may have a couple of sessions with a sports psychologist, but actually here is a support system that we've introduced you to before. Here's a number you can call, and here's a group you can go to. We're putting on a webinar here, but you've got a system of support, people who can go, yeah, I've been there and it's okay. And I think maybe, as we've drawn to an end, it's okay, I've been there, it is normal. And that's an overwhelming message I'd like to get across here, is that to any athlete coming out of the Commonwealth Games feeling low, feeling lost, feeling life isn't worth living, feeling abandoned, those feelings are normal. They're part of the human response to high level experience that you've put everything into. It is normal and it will pass. But finding people who've been in the same experience, going through it, talking to them to realize that you're not alone, that others are going through the same thing, that what you're experiencing isn't out of the ordinary. There's nothing wrong with you. Yeah, it may be very intense. If so, there is psychological support out there, but actually those feelings of loss and abandonment are normal. And speaking to people who've been through it or who are going through it, certainly from our research knowledge as it stands at the moment, is what the athletes want, what they need, and what they find useful.
Thank you for that. So I usually finish with 2 questions. The first one is, what is your favorite exercise?
Favorite exercise?
Yes.
As in sporting exercise. So I'm a ex-swimmer. I still swim, but I do triathlon, endurance triathlon, so 70.3, and so I love swimming. I enjoy running, and I hate cycling.
Oh
But I do
no.
all three.
All right, awesome. And where people can find you if they want to follow your research or reach out, where should they go online?
Okay, so I don't have a huge online presence. I am on X, Dr. Karen Howells on X. I am very happy to take emails if anyone would like to contact me directly. My email is klhowells@cardiffmet.ac.uk. I am on LinkedIn, but I don't big on social media, but very happy to take emails and answer any questions that I can, particularly if it's related to post-Olympic blues and so on, but also through X.
Thank you so much, Karen. Very, very grateful to have you here today and to answer my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Alex.